In this lesson, we'll explore some of the toolpaths that we could use to machine this part. The file that I've opened is called Chain Guard Setup 1, and as you can see, it already has a machine selected. However, there's no toolpaths on it. Just to become a little more familiar with this part, if we look at the stock setup option, we'll see that there is a stock defined, and I can just tell that since this is grayed out, and since solid mesh was selected, they most likely picked a solid body to define the stock, so we'll explore that shortly. And we also notice that it's not displayed here, so if I click on display, you'll see that that stock gets displayed. On our levels tab, we have a few levels, very similar to the previous files, and one of them is called stock, and that stock happens to be a solid block, and that block was the solid that was chosen to define our stock. I'll turn off stock for now and go back to the Toolpaths Manager. I'm also going to quickly look at the actual tool manager here, and you can tell that there are 4 tools already in this file. So unless we need a different tool, we can choose specifically from this list. And finally, under the Planes tab, you can see that we have a new plane called Op1, which is our current WCS and our construction and tool plane. And as you can see, it's set up right here in the corner, and it happens to be right at the corner of our stock, which, again, going to the Levels Manager, you'll see that it's the corner of our actual defined stock. So let's start by facing off the top of this part. So I'm going to go to the Toolpaths tab, and as we saw, there's no toolpaths currently on this part. But under the 2D group on the Toolpaths tab, I'm going to choose Dynamic Facing. In here, I'm going to select the top of the stock. However, my stock definition is not something you can select. But if I do turn on levels, and I briefly turn on stock, you'll see that I can select it here. Now I'm going to turn off stock so we can see our part again. And that's all I need to select for facing. When I go to the Tool tab, you'll notice there's really no face mill here. The closest thing we have is a 1/2-inch bull nose. So I'm going to right click and create a tool. And I'm going to select face mill. And for this, I can actually just accept the defaults and go to finish. So now I have a tool 1, which is a 1.5-inch face mill. I'll call this facing. And let's take a look at our cut parameters. One way is acceptable for now. Of course, we could always change it later. And for the stock to leave on floors, I'm going to make that 0. Now, if you remember, the geometry I selected was the stock. However, the stock is actually a few thousandths above the part. So under linking parameters, I'm going to choose depth. And I'm going to tell it to actually face it off to this point right here, which is a little bit below the WCS. Let's click OK. We'll zoom out and we'll take a look at this. In the Toolpaths tab, if I backplot this, we'll see that the tool comes in and it does a one-way facing. And as you can see, it faces below the top of the stock, right at the top of our part. And finally, let's create a stock model that represents the stock after we faced it. So under the stock group on your Toolpaths tab, you click on stock model. And the first thing we're going to do is name it. Now, I like to name my stock models in order as I create them. So for example, this will be 1- after facing. And I know that this stock model represents what the stock looks like after I faced it. Now I need to give it an initial stock shape. And in this case, I'm going to go right down here and tell it to use my stock setup. So what that does is it changes my stock shape to model, and these are grayed out, so it's representing the model that I selected for my stock. I need to tell it which operations to apply to this stock model, and I'm going to choose my facing operation. And finally, back on stock definition, I'm going to make sure that my stock plane is updated accordingly, and I'm going to use the top plane. And the reason is because my stock setup was also set up using the top plane. So let's click OK. And our stock model gets calculated. So we have the facing operation. And then we have the stock model that represents our stock after facing. And as you can tell, the stock model is dropped down a couple thousandths because we faced that off using the facing operation. In the next lesson, we're going to rough and finish some of the internal pockets, including this one here, and that'll get us set up so we can put an OptiRough on this toolpath.